Hello, everyone. My name is Alina Bonadonna, and I am super happy to welcome you to one more cool Academy session, definitely. And please welcome to our today's session, Melanie Firestone. How are you, Melanie?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm good. How are you?
Amazing. And you guys, how are you doing? From where you are now listening our session, and of course, shoot on some reactions. So we see that you hear us well, see us well. Let me start this. Oh yeah, they're coming more and more and more reaction. Yeah, great. And guys, shoot on in a question window from where you are listening to us now. Melanie, where you are now, by the way?
So I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States.
Yeah, cool. Quite far because I'm currently in Zurich and I'm very happy that weather today is amazing. One of these rare time when it's quite sunny. And I do apologize that I didn't introduce Melanie properly because Melanie is the assistant professor, University of Minnesota. Uh, and today she will share one of the most important topics about recent outbreaks and basically their influence for the global food system. So I will not tell much about this because Melanie will have her time. Just for brief, very brief technical checkup, guys, as always, we have an amazing, beautiful speaker who will have her time to share her slides, and then after, of course, come in question answer session, and don't hesitate to drop questions already during the session. So, Melanie, are you ready?
I am. So before I get started, I'll do just a little brief introduction about myself. So as Alina mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health. But I often call myself an accidental academic. My plan for myself was to actually work for government public health agencies for a long time, and then consider academia later on. But I had this great opportunity to join the University of Minnesota and still have the opportunity to collaborate closely with government public health agencies. And so I took advantage of that opportunity. So prior to joining the University of Minnesota, I actually worked for the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention for several years. And I primarily worked in the COVID-19 response because I worked there from 2020 to 2022. So it was a very busy time there. But I've also worked for the New York City Department of Health for several years as well. So I'm an epidemiologist by training. And so today you'll hear about these recent outbreaks from an epidemiologist's perspective.
Cool, guys. So you already understood how much information you will get today. Okay, Melanie, if you're ready, just share your screen. I will disappear for a while, and time is yours.
Okay, great. All right, let's go ahead and share here. All right, and you all are seeing my presentation?
Yes, all fine, all fine.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned for this presentation, I'm going to talk about three outbreaks that occurred over the last few years. And I'm going to use my perspective as an epidemiologist to describe the broader trends that these outbreaks represent. So first, I want to start with an overview of the cycle of public health prevention. The foundation of foodborne illness prevention is what we call public health surveillance. Public health surveillance is the ongoing systematic collection, analysis, and interpretation of reports of health data to drive action. And public health surveillance is used to detect outbreaks. So once an outbreak is detected, an investigation can be done to identify the cause of the outbreak, including root causes or to identify new hazards. And then the findings from the investigation can be used to drive new research or research into new prevention measures. And then, because this functions as a cycle, Public health surveillance can then provide feedback on the effectiveness of these prevention measures. So if we see a decline in foodborne illnesses, or if we see a reduction in foodborne illnesses associated with a commodity, that's essentially how this works as a feedback loop. So I want to use 3 outbreaks as a lens to discuss new and emerging risks as a result of changing preferences, climate change, and technology that are relevant on a global scale. So some of these outbreaks occurred more than a year ago, but I selected them as examples because the articles about them were published within the last year. So let's start with a Salmonella serotype Branderup outbreak that occurred in Europe in 2021. On May 3rd, 2021, Denmark notified the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, or ECDC, about a genomic cluster of Salmonella Branderup cases. This notification was made through the Epidemic Intelligence Information System, which is now called the European Surveillance Portal for Infectious Diseases, or EpiPulse. Also on May 3rd, 2021, Belgium reported an increase in Salmonella Branderup cases, including 4 isolates that were genetically similar to the outbreak strain in Denmark. And then during May 4th through 6th, 9 other countries reported cases. So recognizing this significant increase in cases, a multi-country outbreak was declared, and the first international coordination meeting was held on May 12th, 2021. And the ECDC established an international outbreak team that consisted of members from the affected countries to investigate and identify the source. During the international coordination meetings, the team discussed epidemiologic and laboratory findings, developments in national investigations, and working hypotheses. They also developed a common case definition and shared whole genome sequencing data with the ECDC for centralized analyses. And by May 20th, there were more than 200 Salmonella Branderup isolates matching the Danish outbreak strain from 12 different countries. So this was quite a large outbreak. And to provide a little more context about this, during 2015 to 2019, there were an average of about 300 cases per year in the EU and the European Economic Area, which includes the EU countries Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. Initial hypothesis generating interviews in the UK and Denmark and initial epidemiologic studies conducted in the UK suggested that melons, other than watermelons, might be the possible food vehicle. So this led to a small melons working hypothesis. A supplemental questionnaire was developed and distributed to affected countries for interviewing. And this supplemental questionnaire was modified as appropriate with special consideration for varying terms used for different melon types in different countries. By July 6, 2021, there were 348 confirmed Salmonella Branderup cases reported from the 12 EU or EEA countries and the UK. There were also cases in Canada, Switzerland, and the US. This figure shows the number of cases in each European country except Switzerland. The lighter colors represent fewer cases and the darker colors represent more cases. So it's important to note that the number of reported cases in each country is affected by the sequencing and surveillance activities within each country. So this is likely an underestimation of the true number of cases that occurred in this outbreak. 3 case control studies were conducted with the goal of assessing the association between consumption of various foods and illnesses. One case control study in the United Kingdom found an association with melon consumption, especially Gallia melons and cantaloupe, but also an association with bananas, chicken, oranges, and leeks. A case control study in Denmark found a weak association between illness and melon consumption. And a third case control study found an association between melon consumption, especially Gallia melons, and illnesses. The UK and Denmark conducted supply chain analyses, which pointed to melon products imported from Honduras. In response to the supply chain analyses, the UK collected 200 melon samples that came from a single grower in Honduras. UK officials tested cantaloupe, Gallia melons, and honeydew melons. Gallia melons are a hybrid melon that was developed in Israel in the 1970s, and it's a cross between a cantaloupe, which is known for having a mesh-like outer surface, and a honeydew, which has a smoother outer surface and greener flesh. Salmonella branderup, matching the outbreak strain, was isolated from 2 of the Gallia melon samples. So additional samples supported melons as the likely food vehicle causing illness. Outside of the active outbreak investigation, the outbreak strain was identified in a pooled peel sample taken from Gallia melons, cantaloupe, and honeydew melons in Austria. In Finland, the outbreak strain was identified in environmental samples taken from a hobby hen house where chickens had been fed melon rinds. And in Germany, the outbreak strain was identified in pooled feces samples from zoo bears who were routinely fed melons. In response to this outbreak, several countries issued public health advisories or food safety controls, including a recall. Honduran authorities launched an investigation and found the outbreak strain on the surface of a washing tank in the packing facility, and corrective measures were taken on site. So typically from September to April, melons are imported into Europe from Brazil, Costa Rica, and Honduras, with Honduras providing the majority. But in the summer months, Spain is the main producer and exporter of melons throughout Europe. So this figure shows the epidemic curve with the number of new cases per week by country. And as you can see from this figure, cases reached a peak in mid to late April and began to decline thereafter, which corresponds with the transition from Honduran melons to Spanish melons. So while a root cause was not identified in this outbreak, it is suspected that unusually high rainfall in Honduras during the harvest period resulted in sewage overflow, and that runoff contaminated the water that was used to irrigate the melons. So as we begin to see more effects of climate change, these types of situations may become more common. Year-round demand that drives globalization of sourcing might mean that localized climate events, such as flooding, could manifest as outbreaks both locally and globally. So one of the major successes of this outbreak was the international level coordination, which helped improve national investigations through information sharing and coordination and consistency in methodology. And this was particularly important as many resources were strained during this time due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So based on lessons learned from this outbreak and other recent outbreaks, the European Food Safety Authority and the ECDC created the One Health whole genome sequencing system in June of 2022. And the goal of this system was to improve data sharing for cluster detection and outbreak investigations by bringing together foodborne isolates from humans, food, feed, animals, and environmental samples. So switching gears slightly, the second outbreak I want to talk about is a Salmonella weltavredin outbreak that occurred in West Bengal, India. On August 10th, a person sought medical care for acute gastrointestinal symptoms at a hospital in a city in West Bengal. On the same day, a large number of people with similar symptoms sought medical care at the same hospital and other nearby hospitals. And given this sudden increase and similarity of symptoms, officials began to suspect a common source of illness. On August 12, 2022, 16 stool samples and 14 rectal swabs were collected from patients. And 8 of the 30 samples, or 27%, were confirmed positive for Salmonella weltavredin using pulsed field gel electrophoresis. All of the isolates were genetically indistinguishable. And the isolates were susceptible to all of the tested antimicrobials except erythromycin. During August 10th through 13th, 2022, health officials identified 129 people from 2 neighboring districts who were ill. And overall, there were 65 people that were hospitalized, but there were many other people that were treated as outpatients. So this figure shows the distribution of cases from August 10th through August 13th, 2022. Most cases had symptom onsets during August 10th and 11th, suggesting that people were exposed during a very short window of time. So during the investigation, it was determined that 129 people reported consuming pani puri from a local street stall on October 9th and 10th. Pani puri is a popular street food, and this particular product contained mashed potatoes, chopped onions, boiled lentils, and spicy turmeric sour water. And this image here is actually from the write-up. So you can see this was pictures that were actually taken as part of the investigation. So during the investigation, the food stall was closed and a water sample was collected. No food was available for testing and no pathogens were isolated from the water sample. Pani puri is commonly produced without running water for hand washing and cleaning though. So the investigators believe that the contamination was related to preparation procedures and poor personal hygiene of the food handler. So over the last 2 decades, Salmonella weltavredin has emerged as a dominant serotype in Southeast Asia. It's commonly found in seafood and aquatic environments. And in India, it is mainly epidemic in coastal areas. There's been a few notable outbreaks of Salmonella weltavredin, including a 2012 community outbreak in Kolkata and a 2015 outbreak among tea workers in Oman. And additionally, a study from 2012 to 2015 found that geckos were a reservoir for Salmonella weltavredin in Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. While Salmonella weltavredin is an emerging serotype in Southeast Asia, the globalization of food means that it is a growing concern worldwide. In the US, there was a 2015 outbreak associated with frozen tuna imported from Indonesia, and a 2021 outbreak associated with frozen pre-cooked shrimp imported from India. Since Salmonella weltavredin is commonly found in seafood and aquatic environments, warmer ocean temperatures associated with climate change might exacerbate contamination events. As a result, this might contribute to outbreaks that occur locally where the serotype is endemic or globally as a result of exportation. So finally, the third outbreak that I want to talk about, it was a Listeria monocytogenes outbreak that occurred in Finland from 2015 to 2019. In May of 2019, the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare identified 2 cases of listeriosis with isolates of sequence type 37. Investigators searched a laboratory database to identify similar sequence types from 2015 onward. Overall, 6 cases were identified, including 4 during April to June of 2019, 1 from 2015, and 1 from 2018. Ages ranged from late 40s to mid 70s, and all of the people with cases had immunocompromising conditions. The 4 from 2019 had all been patients at a hospital in southern Finland. And unfortunately, 2 patients died within 15 days of their listeriosis diagnosis. 2 people were interviewed using an online questionnaire, and clinical information was collected for 2 patients who visited the hospital. Exposure information was not available for 2 people. And it was determined that the 4 patients with illness onset in 2019 had received dialysis treatment at the same hospital. So hospital menus for treatment days were reviewed, and it was determined that the patients were served snacks during their dialysis treatment that were not served to other hospital patients or staff. So here's a list of the items. The fava bean products, examples of which are pictured here, were used as a plant-based meat alternative in salads and sandwiches. So this figure shows the potential exposure dates for the 4 patients in blue, symptom onset in yellow, diagnosis in red, and death in black. 3 of the 4 patients had symptom onset at the end of April, and the 4th had symptom onset at the beginning of June. On May 3rd, 2019, a sanitarian visited the hospital kitchen and collected environmental samples. They noticed sanitation issues with storage and cleaning equipment and automatic temperature monitoring. However, there were no temperature violations with the refrigerator or freezer that were used for snacks for the dialysis patients. And none of the environmental samples that were taken were found to be positive. More than 2 years later, in November 2021, Listeria matching the outbreak strain was detected from a fava bean product sample that was collected as a part of routine HACCP sampling from a company in Finland. In response to the positive samples identified during routine sampling, environmental sampling at the production facility was conducted in December of 2021. 591 surface samples were taken from the processing environment. and 41 or 7% of these were positive. The positive samples were taken from floors, nearby surfaces, and a ripening machine. And in response to these findings, the company issued a recall of the affected products, intensified cleaning and disinfection procedures, updated HACCP sampling plans for production areas, and conducted additional staff training. So this company began large-scale production and distribution of the fava bean products in 2016 as a plant-based protein alternative. The facility had previously produced other products, which likely explains why there was a case in 2015 that occurred before this product was in production. The product was made from whole fava beans and was recommended to be consumed as is or used in sauces, patties, and baking. In August of 2022, Listeria was detected in 2 more HACCP samples from another fava bean product produced by the same company. All of the product samples from November 2021 and August 2022 were genetically similar to those isolated from the 6 cases. On August 9th, 2022, the company announced a recall of the affected product pictured here. So at the time that this product was served in the hospital, it was considered a ready-to-eat product. The investigators suspect that Listeria that was persistent in the production environment entered the product after pasteurization. In November 2022, the producer added a heating requirement to package labels seen here in the new product packaging. In March 2023, the heating requirement was extended to all products that did not have sufficient Listeria destruction treatment in their final product packaging. The authors noted that this was the first known listeriosis outbreak associated with a plant-based product that included fava beans. Previous research has shown that pea protein-based meat alternatives can support listeria growth. In this outbreak, listeria was persistent in the manufacturing environment, which, as you all know, is not uncommon in food production. So as the demand for plant-based proteins grows in response to desires to mitigate the impacts of climate change, associated with animal protein production, there's a growing need to ensure plant-based proteins have adequate preventive controls. So in order to discuss some key takeaways from these outbreaks, it's important to talk about some changes in the food systems that these outbreaks represent. The food system is increasingly becoming globalized. A 2016 study demonstrated that more than 2/3 of crops that are a part of national diets globally originated from somewhere else. For example, tomatoes are a staple of meals in Italy and chilies are a staple in Thailand, but both of these crops originated in South America. And this trend of globalization has increased in the last 50 years. The globalization of the food supply means that populations are increasingly exposed to new and emerging risks. Some of these may be driven by preferences, some by climate change, and some by emerging technologies or a combination of these factors. It's worth noting that the demand for protein is increasing globally as well. So this is in part due to increases in population sizes, but also because of a growing demand for meat and dairy products among growing middle income populations and urban populations. Simultaneously, increasing concerns about health, sustainability issues, and climate change have led to a shift in some populations to more plant-based diets with the goal of mitigating individual health or environmental issues. This has led to an increase in product availability of meat substitutes, like in the fava bean product outbreak. So this figure shows the increasing demand for protein consumption per capita as grams per capita per day overall in high income countries in red and low and middle income countries in green. So in the first outbreak, off-season demand led to importation of melons from Central America. And while the cause of the outbreak was not determined, it was believed that heavy rains contributed to contamination, which is something that climate change is likely to exacerbate. Similarly, the second outbreak was caused by an emerging pathogen of concern, primarily associated with seafood and aquatic environments. Rising ocean temperatures due to climate change are likely to exacerbate this both in the local production environments and globally as products are exported. The third outbreak occurred in a technologically produced item to meet an increasing demand to mitigate the impacts of climate change associated with animal protein production. As globalization increases and climate change exacerbates challenges, improving our ability to detect and respond to outbreaks will become increasingly important. This will require strong surveillance systems and improved cross-country collaboration, which we are already seeing advancements in, as demonstrated by the first outbreak and the integration of data systems that resulted from that. So ultimately, better detection and response to outbreaks leads to better prevention. As we identify growing and production areas where contamination events occur, prevention at the source should improve health for populations in those areas and globally if the products are exported. And this is because emerging pathogens anywhere can affect people everywhere. So as our food systems become increasingly globalized, improved surveillance and prevention efforts have the potential to benefit people everywhere. And with that, I will turn off my screen sharing.
Thank you very much,
And I'm
Melanie.
happy to answer questions.
Let's shoot on some reaction. I hope you like the presentation. And until our attendees gather their, oh, there are already coming first questions. So first question is coming from Jeff Banks. The suggestion that ST37 was persistent in the Finnish plant is supported by substantial environmental sampling and testing data from European plants over the past 10 years. Do you experience a similar pattern of ST37 persistence in US plants?
So I'm not sure specifically about ST37, but we do have persistence of listeria in processing plants in the US as well. We with listeria, we tend to see a lot of these prolonged outbreaks because there can be this low level of contamination that happens in plants. Listeria doesn't affect everyone who comes into contact with it, so it's not uncommon for us to see these very prolonged outbreaks that happen because of this low level of contamination that can persist within processing plants. I think there's a recent outbreak that occurred in the U.S. with boar's head processed meats, and it seems like that might have also been due to listeria persistence in the environment. And ultimately, what they decided in that outbreak was that they ended up shutting the plant down, and they're no longer producing food because there were some widespread issues that were happening there.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And what do you think, like what kind of policies or maybe global frameworks could help mitigate the risk posed by increasing globalization and climate change, for example?
So I think one of the biggest things that we'll need as we're having this increasingly globalized food system is that we're going to need more and more coordination between countries, both to identify when problems occur, but also to learn from each other about ways to prevent them. So I think the system that was created in Europe that really integrated multiple different data sources, we're going to need more and more of that going forward because what we might be seeing in some countries is that things that are happening in one country might also be happening in another country, and our ability to detect them just might not be very strong. But if we are able to better integrate our data systems, work together better across countries, then we might be able to both get a better understanding of new hazards as they're emerging and find better ways to prevent them going forward.
Yeah, definitely. And there is another question came from Teo Irawo. With globalization, do food importers need to consider the effect of climate change in risk assessment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's certainly something that could be considered, but I think that that's something that's going to happen anywhere that you are. So whether or not it's a product that's being eaten locally, or if it's a product that's being imported, I think it's important to consider what's happening on the larger global scale, but also just ensuring that you have the regular preventive controls in place for ensuring that the products you're importing are safe, or the products you're consuming are safe. So, like with cantaloupe or other products, like ensuring that there's proper washing procedures and that kind of thing for these products that aren't actually consumed, that are consumed raw and not cooked. You'll still want to have those regular preventive controls as well. So I think there is some consideration of how local climatic events might affect the larger food system, but I think we're going to see that happening elsewhere as well. So it's certainly something to consider.
Yeah, thank you very much. Next question is coming from Mike Villaneva. Were any specific recommendations issued to growers or processors from regulatory agencies to reduce risks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that this is something that is being considered of how we can better prevent issues from happening in the field. It's something that's really challenging because generally it's not a very controlled environment. I'm not sure of anything specifically that's happening currently, but I think that this is something that is on everybody's radar and that we need to start thinking about more, and maybe is some work in this area that's being done already. I haven't heard of much so far other than just regular good manufacturing practices or good production practices and whatnot generally. But in this the first outbreak with the melons, there did seem to be some contamination in the washing facilities for the melons, and so making sure that we're having better cleaning practices for things like that will be an important part of this as well.
And how would, for example, in your opinion, food handlers, manufacturers, regulatory authorities work together to minimize this risk in supply chain, for example?
Yeah, so I think food safety really depends on all of us. Everyone has a different role to play within this system. So manufacturers, I think it's important to continue with risk assessments, preventive controls, that kind of thing. From a microbiology standpoint, any prevention research that we can identify, different practices that we can identify to reduce this, I think will continue to be important. And then from an epidemiologist perspective, our ability to detect outbreaks is really critical to being able to identify and monitor new hazards in order to drive these prevention opportunities. So I think food safety is such an important, it's so important to have collaboration across all forms of work that people are doing, whether it be academia, government, industry, or even consumers. And so I think the more that we can kind of learn from each other and partner with each other, the better our food safety systems will be.
Yeah, definitely. That's why we have this community where we can openly discuss such questions and bring it here actually to the table. The question coming from Mohammed Sabir Idris. How can the global food system enhancing safety protocols and monitoring mechanisms to effectively prevent and respond to foodborne illness outbreaks, thereby ensuring consumer health and maintaining public trust?
Yeah, I think the public trust issue is a really great question. In particular, I think one of the things, I don't know if this has happened as much in Europe, but one of the things that's really been challenging within the US is that there has been this distrust in our public health systems more broadly, especially coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think one of the things that we need to do more of in order to kind of rebuild some of that trust is really have transparency. With our food systems constantly changing and the speed that they're changing, we're not always going to know the answers right away, but the more that we can learn and the more that we can be transparent about what we know, what we don't know, when we have the ability to prevent it, like being clear with what our prevention steps are. Anytime we can sort of focus on transparency within the system, I think that will help rebuild some of the trust within our systems. But from in a public health perspective, the way that we kind of view all things is sort of in this interdisciplinary collaborative nature. We need to learn from each other in order to better prevent people from getting sick. So foodborne disease isn't something that is just the responsibility of one person. It's the responsibility of many people. So I think any opportunities that we can have across businesses as well for people to learn from each other's experiences without it being like a proprietary concern will be really important as well. I wish I had a better answer of like this is the way that we fix everything, but I think this is something that we're all really going to have to kind of be in together to figure out how to better prevent people from getting sick. And the outbreak that I mentioned too, the Salmonella weltevreden, it was very localized outbreak that happened within this one area in India that it was associated with a food at a food stall. But if we when we think about it, like there's this emerging pathogen that's happening within this region of the world, but we're seeing it kind of pop up in other places as well. And so any prevention measures that we have in one location could potentially have benefits in the other as well. So if we have, better prevention and control at the source where the products are being grown or processed, that will help both locally reduce the risk of illness and more globally as products are exported.
Thank you so much. Next question we have already from Jeff Banks. With reference to the ongoing outbreak of E. coli 0121 associated with California grown carrots, would you eat retailed carrots that had been simply peeled, washed, and packed in a centralized manufacturing facility? Provocating question, right? Yeah.
So I think everyone's comfort level really varies with foodborne disease risk. So when I'm thinking about whether or not I would eat something, I think about first of all, is it something that I enjoy eating? We always use oysters as an example in the U.S. of foodborne a potentially risky food item. I don't like oysters, so I wouldn't put myself to eat this food item that is potentially a riskier item because it's not something I enjoy. So I always would consider things like preferences and my own personal risk level with some of this. Like if you have an immune compromising condition, maybe you're less likely to take a risk. So for me personally, carrots aren't a huge part of my diet, so it probably wouldn't necessarily come up anyway. But I think it's a tough one to answer because everyone has their own level of comfort with all of this.
Yeah, there's definitely like this. We have a next question from Petronella Niacale. How can we, manufacturers, get the public involved in food safety culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it does come back to just transparency um, and partnerships with different organizations that really focus on food safety. I mean, food safety is important from the manufacturer side, but it's also important from the consumer side. Sometimes consumers are going to just kind of go for whatever they're comfortable with, even if they know it's like a potentially risky item, as I mentioned, like with oysters. But I think just having a transparency in the manufacturing process, the openness of the company, talking about what we what the company's responsibility is and what the consumer's responsibility is, I think are important as well. It's really building trust. It takes a long time, and building engagement takes a long time. So there's not going to be an easy overnight solution, but having those interactions, I think, will be a good first starting place.
Yeah. Next question is about technology, basically. What role can technological advancements such as blockchain, AI-driven analytic play in improving traceability and transparency in the global food supply chain to minimize the impact of future outbreaks?
Yeah. So I think technology is going to play an important role. I think one thing, kind of back to the last question as well, I think one thing that consumers don't always realize with our food systems is how hard it is to actually trace back where an item was grown or where it was produced. For some products, it's easier than others. So I think that with blockchain or other technologies that are going to improve our traceability, it's going to not only help us better recall products potentially as needed as an issue arises, but I think that's a great area for also talking to um, consumers and sharing that information with consumers to realize like how this food system works and where the consumer kind of fits in with this system.
Thank you, Melanie. Actually, it was also one of my questions, like, is there any kind of, how to say, like, uh, data exchange between countries to prevent these outbreaks, or like after, to ensure that it will not happen again?
Yeah, so there's certainly some coordination between countries. One of the things that we always say with outbreaks is that outbreaks are like snowflakes. No two outbreaks are the same. And I think that that kind of ends up being true with some of the interactions that people have as well. So typically, multiple countries will work together when there's a product that's within multiple countries. In the US, we often have outbreaks of products that are common between the US and Canada. And so there's a lot of coordination there too. But I think anytime we can have better coordination between countries and the systems in place for responding to these outbreaks, so that you're not having to figure out who to talk to in an outbreak or who to work with, is really important. And I think it's also really important from the company perspective too, you know, coming from working in government public health agencies, we're always really, the outbreak investigation will always go better and prevention measures will always go better when there's coordination between the public health authorities and the industry partners that may produce the product. We're all kind of, nobody wants to make people sick, so we're all in this together to make it better, both when it's actively happening and after the fact.
Yeah, definitely, that's true. Next question. Are there international efforts to improve traceability, particularly with fresh produce, similar to US FDA efforts?
That's a great question. I am more familiar with the US side of this. You know, based on what I've seen, I know there's a lot of work to be able to do this in Canada as well. But I'm not sure what some of the other practices more globally are for this. Um, I think just the fact that in the EU, they currently have this system that integrates data from routine sampling and human isolates. I think that's a good example of the type of work that can be done with this, although that's not exactly traceability. But yeah, I'm not as familiar with work outside of the US or Canada on this.
Actually, guys, 12th of December, we will have another open talk about outbreaks. It will be more like summary of this year outbreaks with Darren Detwiller. So I'm inviting you already to join this session. It will be like interview format. So definitely you can ask this question to him. Maybe he knows something more. So I have a chance to jump in with my question, like in regards of consumer education campaigns. How can such campaigns, and if they are existing, how can they reduce foodborne illness cases in households and communities in general?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, I think it's food safety kind of starts with everybody. Um, I think there are a lot of consumer food safety campaigns that happen within the US. A lot of them focus on different timely events. So, like next, or not next week, in 2 weeks for us, we have our big holiday of Thanksgiving, where it's a very meal focused holiday. So there's always a lot of consumer campaigns that happen throughout the year, but especially before big holidays like that that are associated with food. I think they're a really important component, but I also think that there is more that we could be doing at younger ages too. I think in our educational systems, there's room for having more discussions about food safety in classrooms, starting in elementary school. Everybody eats from a young age, like from day one. So this can really start even earlier within our school systems, I think, as well. But I think you're always going to run into people sometimes knowing a food item might be risky and choosing to consume it anyway. And so I think having as much of a reduction in risk from the manufacturing standpoint or the food production standpoint is an important safeguard as well.
Yeah, definitely. And we have few more questions, and as always, we are running out of time, but we will try to keep it short and match our 1 hour timing. So, what are the primary pathogens responsible for foodborne illnesses, and how do they transmission patterns and how do their transmission patterns impact food safety policies?
Yeah, so one of the most common ones that we see as a big issue in the US is something like norovirus, which is often spread person to person. And then we also see a lot of issues with Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, for example. Listeria is less common, but those and Campylobacter is kind of the big ones that we see here. So the way that some of these pathogens kind of the biology of them occurs kind of changes how we see whether or not they occur as outbreaks or not. Norovirus, as I mentioned, is very commonly spread person to person. So we can see a lot of these events that might have a foodborne disease component, or they might involve human to human interaction. Things like Campylobacter, we don't really see Campylobacter grow in the environment like we do with something like Salmonella. So a lot of the work that I've done in the past has been around restaurant inspections and how restaurant inspections can prevent transmission of foodborne disease within restaurants. Salmonella can take advantage of the major pathways of transmission in restaurants, more so than something like Campylobacter, because we don't see things like Campylobacter growing on surfaces or proliferating on surfaces. So for things like Campylobacter, we would be more concerned about contamination of the product initially. Salmonella, we're concerned about contamination of the product. We're concerned about cross contamination. We're concerned about like food handling within the environment that might contribute to its growth or not. So when we think about foodborne diseases, it's really important to think about how they can grow, where they proliferate, and how that can really impact whether or not we see these outbreaks proliferate.
Yeah. And one more question coming out from this one. What are the challenges in addressing the relationship between food health and inclusion at local levels?
Um, Food health, is that what you said?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Food, health, and
Oh, food
inclusion.
health.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think one of the things that's really challenging with all of this is just how our changing preferences can lead to both new risks emerging, but also sometimes engaging in consumption of items that or that may or may not be sort of riskier. We've done some studies in the US that have shown that oftentimes people with higher education will be more likely to consume a hamburger pink, so potentially undercooked, because of preferences. So I think we're kind of back to my other message here. We each have a role in all of this and preventing um, foodborne disease from spreading. And it's really important to ensure that every person is able to participate in their role in preventing it.
Yeah. And probably we will still have time for one more question. We just now came in. What are the key strategies for preventing foodborne illness outbreaks in the global food system, and how can government, industries, and consumers collaborate to improve these food safety standards?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to have good agricultural practices, good manufacturing practices, and good practices at the point of service. So whether or not that's the restaurant or within the consumer household, those are all going to be important aspects for all of this. In the U.S., just we've have the Food Safety Modernization Act, which it's been about 13 years now since we've had that, but it's been a little bit of a slow process to get all of the different practices in place and get all of the different industries in place. But it's a really useful way for looking at different um, environments where food is grown and produced, different preventive practices within those different environments. And then they also have some particularly risky food items that they have the recommendations or practices for regarding food safety for those, such as sprouts. Sprouts is its own um, kind of thing there. So I think really this focus on these good agricultural practices, these good manufacturing practices, is going to continue to be an important step moving forward, especially as we see climate sort of impacting all of this. And there might be a need for more consideration with the impacts of climate change and some of this as well going forward.
Yeah, and I would select actually one of this recent question as this summary from you, Melanie. For example, what are the main food safety challenges posed by foodborne diseases in low-income countries? And how can international cooperation help address these issues? Summarizing in general our topic today.
Yeah. So I think, anytime we see an outbreak that is identified in like a higher income country, for example, I think that there is an important aspect of sharing the information with the country and partnering with the country where the product might have been grown or imported from. I think, any lessons that we learn from outbreaks, either about the characteristics of the pathogen, the characteristics of contamination, um, or the characteristics of like storage or transportation of the food item. Anytime that we learn anything about this from an outbreak, we should be sharing that information back. We should be partnering with different countries and providing these as opportunities for all of us to grow and learn and do better, and not just on the importation side of this.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, guys, for being so active today. I love reading a lot of questions. I hope you, Melanie, enjoyed today is talking to us, being in our community. So let's shoot on some nice reactions, some nice hearts and claps. And yeah, guys, also thanks to Nemis Technologies to supporting our project. And see you next time for our next academy, which will be already in 2 weeks, where we will talk about food safety culture. So be prepared to also actively participate, and have a nice evening to everyone who is in the same time zone as me, and a nice working day for those who are in US, and see you soon. Bye bye.
Thank